Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time we're going to be tackling something that I know a lot of our listeners have been asking about, XR in education.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic right now.
It really is. So we've got this really interesting research paper, actually, from the Together Learning Research Archive from just this year, 2024. And it's based on, a forum that happened last year called Future Hub 2023. And it uses this really fascinating approach called narrative inquiry to kind of get into the minds of educators, researchers, tech specialists who are actually, knee deep in using XR in different learning environments. So I'm really curious to get your take on this because, I think we tend to get really excited about the possibilities. But then the
Mhm.
question becomes like, is this actually translating into, real world impact?
Yeah, and I think that's what I found so refreshing about this particular research study is that it really does focus on those lived experiences. Instead of just giving us the dry statistics or the theoretical frameworks, it actually delves into the nitty-gritty of what it's like for educators who are on the front lines trying to implement this technology.
Yeah. So before we go too far down the rabbit hole here, let's just do a quick level set for our listeners who might not be as familiar with all the jargon. When we're talking about XR, we're talking about extended reality, which is like this big umbrella term that includes things like, augmented reality, which we've all kind of experienced through things like Pokemon Go and those kinds of apps. And then you've got virtual reality, which is that fully immersive, headset experience.
Right, it's stepping into a whole other world.
Exactly. And so the big question is like, we got these amazing technologies, but are they actually living up to the hype when it comes to education?
And it's interesting because I think the pandemic really accelerated the adoption of a lot of these digital tools out of necessity. I mean, suddenly everyone was thrust into this world of remote learning.
Oh, tell me about it. The Zoom fatigue was real.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I think there's this kind of cautious optimism now around XR,
Mm,
where educators are like, okay, this is cool, but is it just a fad? Or is it something that can actually transform the way we teach and learn?
right, right. And so it sounds like this Future Hub forum was really trying to get to the bottom of that. From what I skimmed, it seemed like they brought together quite a diverse group of experts in the field.
Yeah, it was a really fascinating mix of people. So they had 9 educators from all over the world
Yeah.
who were already using XR in their classrooms in some capacity, and they basically just had them share their stories.
Like their war stories.
Exactly what worked, what didn't work, what surprised them, what challenges they ran into. It's like getting a backstage pass to the world of XR in education.
It kind of reminds me of the first time I tried VR. It was just like sensory overload.
Oh, I bet.
But then you kind of get used to it, and then you start to see, like, oh, there's something really powerful here. So, what were some of the big takeaways that emerged from these educator narratives?
Well, one of the things that came up repeatedly was that while the technology itself is amazing, there are still some pretty significant challenges when it comes to actually using it in a classroom setting.
Hmm.
Like, for example, one of the participants, Miraza Alizadeh, she's a professor at the University of Technology in Osaka, Japan, and she was talking about how some of her students experienced cyber sickness, or they found the headsets to be too heavy or uncomfortable, or they had trouble using them because they had poor eyesight.
Oh, wow. So it's interesting. We often talk about accessibility in terms of like, who has access to the technology in the first place. But this is like accessibility at a whole other level. Like, even if you have the technology, can you physically use it comfortably?
Exactly. And I think that's a really important consideration as we're thinking about, you know, making XR more inclusive.
Hmm.
Because if it's only accessible to a certain segment of the population,
Yeah.
then it's not really living up to its full potential.
Right. It's like we're still in the beta testing phase in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for sure.
Figuring out what works, what doesn't, and how to make it work for everyone. It's like we always talk about personalized learning, right?
Yeah.
But this is like personalization on a whole other level because you're actually tailoring the experience to someone's, physical needs and abilities.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the physical aspects either. Like you were saying, even something like stereo blindness,
Hmm.
which affects a small percentage of the population,
Yeah.
can completely change how someone experiences VR.
Yeah, that's right. You were saying that one of the educators in the study, William Hall, he actually uses VR to teach his students about binocular vision.
Yeah. He's at Kyoto Saga University of Arts in Japan, and he uses it specifically to show students how our eyes work together to create depth perception. And what's fascinating is that for students who have stereo blindness, their experience in VR is going to be completely different.
That's wild.
Yeah, and it just highlights the importance of being really intentional. about designing these XR learning experiences and making sure that they're inclusive of all learners.
So it's not just a matter of like, here's the headset, go learn.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It really requires a deep understanding of how different students learn and how to tailor the technology to meet their individual needs.
Okay, so we've got these, technological hurdles, we've got the accessibility piece, but then there's also this whole other challenge of actually integrating XR into like the day-to-day reality of a classroom. Because I imagine it's not as simple as just like, okay, everybody put on your headsets, we're going on a virtual field trip today.
No,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
definitely not that simple. And that's something that came up a lot in these educator narratives as well. They talked about how there's this initial excitement and novelty when you first introduce XR.
Yeah.
But then the challenge becomes like, how do you sustain that engagement over time? How do you make it more than just a gimmick?
Right, because you don't want it to just be like the shiny new toy syndrome.
Exactly. And I think the educators who were most successful were the ones who were really thoughtful about how they integrated XR into their existing curriculum. So it wasn't just like a separate add-on activity. It was actually woven into the fabric of what they were already teaching.
So it's about finding those natural connections between the technology and the learning objectives.
Right. And thinking about how XR can enhance
Yeah.
and deepen the learning experience in ways that wouldn't be possible with traditional methods.
So like you were saying earlier about the stereo blindness example, it's like
Yes.
instead of just reading about binocular vision in a textbook,
Right.
you can actually experience it firsthand in VR.
Exactly. And,
Yeah.
and not just experience it, but experience it from multiple perspectives,
Right.
which is something that's really powerful.
That's really cool. So that sounds like content is key here.
Content is huge because you can have the most amazing technology in the world.
Yeah.
But if the content isn't engaging and relevant, then it's not going to be effective.
And I imagine that's a whole other challenge in itself.
Or absolutely.
Yeah.
Because creating high-quality XR content is not easy. It's time-consuming. It's expensive. And it requires a whole new set of skills.
So it's not something that most teachers can just whip up on their own.
Right. It's definitely a team effort.
Yeah.
And it often involves partnerships between educators and
Right.
technologists and content creators.
Right. It takes a village.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about creating the content either. You also need to think about how you're going to deliver it, how you're going to manage the devices, how you're going to troubleshoot technical issues. There's a whole logistical side to it as well.
So it's like you're basically building a whole new infrastructure for learning.
In a lot of ways, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be really daunting, especially for schools that are already strapped for resources.
Right. And that's something that I wanted to ask you about because, we've been talking a lot about the challenges, but what about the opportunities? Like, what are some of the things that you're most excited about when you think about the potential of XR in education?
Well, I think one of the things that excites me most is the potential for XR to democratize access to learning. Like, imagine a world where every student, regardless of their zip code or their socioeconomic background, has access to the same high-quality learning experiences.
That's a powerful vision.
And I think XR has the potential to make that a reality because it can transport students to places they could never go and allow them to experience things they could only dream of. Like, imagine being able to take a virtual field trip to the Amazon rainforest or to the International Space Station or to ancient Rome.
Or to the inside of the human body.
Exactly. The possibilities are endless.
That's amazing. And it's not just about the content either.
Right.
It's also about the way that XR can personalize the learning experience.
Exactly. Because with XR, you can tailor the pace and the content to each student's individual needs. So students who are struggling can get the extra support they need, and students who are ahead can move at their own pace.
So it's like having a personal tutor for every student.
In a way, yes. And I think that has the potential to be truly transformative.
I agree. So it sounds like we're still in the early days of XR in education.
But absolutely, we're just scratching the surface.
There's a lot of excitement and a lot of potential.
Definitely. And I think the key is going to be to approach it with a spirit of experimentation and collaboration, and to always keep the focus on the learner.
Well said. And, it makes you think like this research was really focused on, kind of formal education settings like schools and universities. But I'm really curious about the potential for XR and all those other places where learning happens, like, museums, libraries, after-school programs, even our own homes.
Oh, absolutely. I
Yeah.
think the potential there is huge. Like, imagine going to a museum, and instead of just looking at, static exhibits, you can actually interact with them in AR.
Like walking with dinosaurs?
Exactly. Or you could put on a VR headset and experience what it was like to live in ancient Rome.
Or go on a guided tour of the inside of a human heart.
Right. And it's not just about making things more engaging and entertaining, although that's definitely part of it. But it's also about giving people access to experiences
Mm-hmm.
that they wouldn't otherwise have.
Right, like I'm thinking about kids who might not have the opportunity to travel to, far off places.
Exactly. Or kids with disabilities who might not be able to physically participate in certain activities.
Mhm.
XR can really level the playing field in that sense.
Absolutely. And I love that you brought up accessibility because I think that's something that often gets overlooked when we're talking about emerging technologies.
Yeah, it's crucial. And I
Yeah.
think the good news is that as XR technology becomes more sophisticated, it's also becoming more accessible.
Like the headsets are getting lighter and less expensive.
Exactly. And there are more and more companies that are
Wow.
developing XR experiences specifically for people with disabilities.
That's encouraging to hear because I think for a lot of people, there's this fear that technology is just going to widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Right, but I think XR has the potential to actually bridge that gap
Mm.
if we're intentional about it.
And that's a great point because it's not just about the technology itself, it's about how we use it.
Exactly. Technology is just a tool
It's up to us to decide how we want to use it.
to shape the future of learning.
Well said, and I think that's a great note to end on. It's been fascinating to dive into this topic with you.
Yeah, this was a really interesting conversation.
And I think it's clear that XR has a lot of potential to transform education, but there are also a lot of challenges that we need to address.
Definitely, but I'm optimistic.
Me too. And I think the key is to keep the focus on what really matters for
Yeah.
creating engaging and equitable learning experiences for all students. So for all of you listening, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the future of XR in education? What are you most excited about? What concerns do you have? Head over to our website or
Yeah.
connect with us on social media and let us know. Until next time, keep exploring.